Hi everybody.
Hi.
So welcome to lesson 7. Today we are learning about Mrs Birling, and the question I've set for us today is Priestley correct to label Mrs Birling a rather cold woman? So these are the stage directions he uses in the opening, and if you remember that was a lesson 1 comment that we made about her personality. So just to remind you that we have got to the point where we've discovered that the reason Gerald was so evasive and distant from Sheila over the summer was because he was having an affair with Eva Smith, who had given herself a new name, Daisy Renton. Okay, so it wasn't until he saw the photo that he realised that was the woman that was his mistress, I guess if that's the right word, and this has now been revealed to the Birlings. Gerald's exited the scene, and our attention will now turn to the next character, Mrs Birling. So the inspectors arrived, and Mrs Birling is very unamused. She does not like the fact that there's been a turn of events because it has ruined her celebratory evening. And let's see how she reacts now the inspector turns his attention to her. So Miss Harrison is going to talk about what we've learned about Mrs Birling so far.
Okay, guys, so what I want you to be doing is thinking about how Priestley has presented Mrs Birling so far in the play. So obviously Miss Wan's already said that in the stage directions she's described as a rather cold woman and her husband's social superior. Now, we haven't heard much from Mrs Birling yet. She hasn't had a chunk of dialogue yet, but she has had little grumblings and little small interactions, particularly with her husband and with Sheila. She comes across to the audience as kind of what the stage directions says she has got this air of superiority about her. You know, she says things to Mrs Birling like, you shouldn't say such things like that in front of the guests, and don't be talking about business around the table and things like that. And it's all about holding up these airs and graces in front of particularly Gerald, who her and Mr Birling are desperately trying. Her interactions with Sheila are quite important as well, because as Sheila is starting to learn from her mistakes and kind of finding her voice amongst people who are trying to silence her, such as Mrs Birling doesn't like that. She believes that particularly Edwardian women should be demure, they should hold the tongue, they shouldn't speak out of turn, they should be very feminine, they shouldn't be outspoken. But what I think we learn about Mrs Birling, as we're going to come on to in a little bit when we analyse the quotes, is she's quite hypocritical, because while she tells Sheila to pipe down and stop being hysterical and things like that, she herself is actually quite outspoken. So yeah, that's what we're going to continue to develop on today.
Thank you. Miss Marshall, do you think you've got anything to add to Miss Harrison's comments?
I think that was a great intro, Mrs Harrison.
Yeah.
I'm just giving you a missus. I've just married you off there, Miss.
Not married yet.
Not yet. You would have been, but you're blooming lockdown. This time next year. Anyway, yeah, I think that's great. Oh, it might be worth noting as well that Mrs Birling actually is out of the room for some of the revelations, isn't she?
Yeah.
And that could be significant as well, because quite often she doesn't hear some of the things that happen straight away, and so she comes into the middle of it often and is quite outraged perhaps to see the way that the other characters are behaving, and that's quite important, because she sometimes misses important information and then reacts differently. Again, in terms of trying to protect Sheila and like you've said, treating her as a child as well, when Sheila's quite adamant that she wants to stay there and find out what's happened. So yeah, let's plough on.
Excellent.
With the first quote.
Okay, brilliant. So the first quote is the one that's been chosen by me, and we are looking at the reasons why Mrs Birling refused to help Eva when she went to her charity organisation. So just to remind you all, because I know you've worked on this in Year 9, Mrs Birling is the head of a charity, the Brumley Charity Organisation. And the idea behind the charity organisation is that people who are in dire need of help, whether that's financial support, I guess, go to them with their case. And it's up to Mrs Birling and the people on the panel to decide if they are willing to offer the person financial assistance. So this was in 1912, and I guess at this point there weren't really things in place like the welfare system which would have helped Eva, so she wouldn't have had to go to places like the charity organisation to get help. Because I guess one of the things that we see here is that it's very much up to the people who make the judgment, and what we see here is the Priestley criticising the way that charities are shaped in Britain, and he believes that this isn't a fair system to help the working class. So, and we can see this example right here, because Mrs Birling says, first she called herself Mrs Birling, and then Mr Birling is astounded, and I want us to focus on that. So I feel like Mrs Birling fails, she clearly shows that she is a rather cold woman here, because rather than seeing that Eva is in a desperate need of help, because she goes there because she's pregnant with Eric's child, and this is something that obviously Mrs Birling doesn't know, and she sees the fact that Eva uses her name as insulting and an attack on her identity. And Mrs Birling's identity is really important to her because it's part of her social capital. It's part of the fact that she feels makes her have a higher status and superiority over others. So when she sees that someone like as lowly as Eva Smith uses it, okay, she sees that as an insult towards her. And the fact that she sort of, the interaction is foregrounded with that actually shows how much empathy she doesn't have. And I think prior to this, because we've had Sheila, who's sort of found out how she's responsible, and she has shown that level of empathy. The only other two people that haven't are, well, I guess Gerald does feel a little bit bad, but like we said last week, it's whether we decide that he is actually genuinely someone that feels empathy and is sorry about what he's done, whereas Mr Birling doesn't feel any sense of sympathy at all. And the fact that Mrs Birling's not like this shows that the lack of empathy is not a male-only trait. I think I've said that about the word empathy about 10 times. So that's the first thing I want to point out. So the next thing is the stage direction that Mr Birling has been given, and I think it's important to sort of, even though we're focused on Mrs Birling, to look at the adjective astounded there, because this is what the upper middle class and those who are in power are more shocked at. They're more shocked at, again, this person using their name, as opposed to the fact that they've had a role to play in Eva Smith's death. Okay, because if they had actually helped her, she probably wouldn't have landed in the situation that she had done, which was to kill herself. And so this is what Mrs Birling says: it was simply a piece of gross impertinence. And this noun, impertinence, is something that I reflected upon when I talked about Sheila a couple of weeks ago, and how the language parallels with Sheila at that point in time. So when Sheila finds out that, or she believes that Eva was laughing at her when she was at Millwoods, the thing that we need to point out here is this is the language that Mrs Birling is using now. And the point I want to make is that her behaviour is impacting on the younger generations. And actually, when we look at Mrs Birling, she's a symbol of the fact that traditional etiquette and traditional roles and everything she embodies, because she heavily believes that there are certain ways that people in society need to behave, and there are certain positions in society that people need to be in for her to feel like society can function properly. And so what Priestley's trying to point out here is that when she uses this idea, this noun impertinence, and Sheila does as well, I believe that shows you there's a great danger that these values are being passed on to the next generation, who Priestley believes are the people that are most likely, if you can mold them correctly, to make better progress for society. And I think that's important to point out. So again, when I look at this noun impertinence, another interpretation we could think about is, again, how selfish Mrs Birling is. She overlooks the fact that this girl is so desperate that she is come to her for help, and she overlooks the idea that this person is living in poverty. She's just simply offended that Eva did not show her the respect that she believes she should have, just because she holds a higher status than her in the class hierarchy. And I think the problem with people like Mrs Birling, if she's a construct of women who are holding positions in these charity organisations and systems, is that if you look at the verb prejudiced, this means this idea that someone who has often unfavourable opinions that are already preconceived ideas. So she would have seen Eva Smith as a working class girl, pregnant, and made a judgment that she was behaved in a moral way. It was more her fault because she should have got help from her husband or her partner. And actually, I think this is the danger, that if people like Mrs Birling are in positions like this, that they will hold prejudiced views and not actually help people when they actually need it. And because she is prejudiced, this leads me on to the noun case. And I looked at the meaning behind the word case, and it says a set of conditions or criteria that someone has to fulfill in order to achieve an outcome. Now, linking the verb prejudice with this, I think that in Mrs Birling's head, she would have had a set of conditions in her head to make her think, right, when should someone get help from the charity system? And actually, I think she thought, well, Eva Smith offended me, and that was a strike against her name, and so she would never have fulfilled those prior conditions so that she would have helped her for a case. And I think the noun case again is very dehumanizing, because she doesn't actually see Eva Smith as a human being. So there's this whole quote here, it just shows the lack of humanity that that Mrs Birling holds. Does anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a comment, and I think I like the way you've broken it down and looked at all the different interpretations of the words to fit in with what you're saying. I agree, and I think it's perhaps worth pointing out as well that women like Mrs Birling that sat on these boards where they were in positions of power, and they sat on these panels, they quite often would do this as a sort of a bit of a hobby, as something to be seen to be doing good in society, but really perhaps the main reason why they do it is because it reflects well on them, and again increases their power, which fits in with some of the things that we've said in previous weeks about how the superficial behaviour of the Birlings and the way that they are perceived to be is more important than how they actually are. And so quite often there might not have been a lot of good behind the intentions of her sitting on this panel at all. And the fact that she uses her power instead to further her own position is one of the dangers that Priestley highlights in the play. The idea that Mrs Birling has the power to do good and chooses not to use it to help somebody vulnerable like Eva because of those prejudices and those ingrained beliefs about her. Yeah,
I did a bit of research because I mean I think I didn't make it clear about what systems were available, and so if there were liberal reforms in 1906, so this play is set in 1912, which tried to alleviate some of the inequalities that working class people had, but I think the issue was that they were very conditional. So I found out that if you lost your job, which Eva in this play has, that you were only limited to 7 shillings. Now, apparently, when I looked into it a little bit deeper, Rowntree, who was also incidentally Joseph Rowntree, who owns Rowntree, like, you know, the people who make fruit pastels, I think they're Rowntree, is that right? No, I think I might be wrong. Anyway, makes confectionery.
yes, no, Rowntree fruit pastels, they're lovely.
Yeah, they are lovely sweets. And he conducted a poverty study in York, and actually the term poverty line, I think, came from this study, and you needed 21 shillings to survive before in society. And actually it's not perfect, the liberal reforms, because they only gave 7 shillings. So she would have been forced into this sort of position and having to go to these quite immoral charity systems. And I think that's what Priestley wanted to comment on, that these reforms had to be better for people.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
I'm going to pass it on to Miss Harrison now, who's moving on to her quote. There you are, Miss Harrison.
Thank you. This quote is taken from in the kind of midst of the inspector's interrogation of Mrs Birling. So he, just like he has with the other characters, is trying to get them to see what they've done to Eva, and what they do to people like Eva because of their positions of power and how they abuse their power over those who are kind of lower down on the social hierarchy. So Mrs Birling says, when the inspector is trying to get her to see what she's done to Eva Smith and take some responsibility for it, Mrs Birling says, "Bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other 3, I did nothing I'm ashamed of, or that won't bear investigation." So here the big kind of things to take away is that she thinks she's completely justified in her decision to turn Eva Smith away, despite her really desperate situation that she's in. She doesn't feel any guilt whatsoever over turning her away. You know, we've had things in the past, earlier in the scene, where she says, you know, like, girls of that class, and she speaks in a very derogatory way about Eva Smith and people in her position. As Miss Wan's already talked about, the fact she's prejudiced against her from the start before she even really hears her full story. The fact that she's used her name kind of sets her up to whatever she's going to say. She's not going to hear it. She's not going to feel any sympathy for her whatsoever, that she's prejudiced against her. So I'm going to look at this idea of bringing pressure to bear upon Mrs Birling. Now, there's a few definitions that you could look at here. So the first one is a continuous physical force exerted on or against an object by something in contact with it. Now, while obviously Mrs Birling isn't physically getting involved with Sheila, you know, they're not in like little fisticuffs or anything like that, but I think the fact that Mrs Birling and Mr Birling are seen as these huge physical forces that have kind of metaphorical physical power over people like Eva Smith, and the fact that the definition of pressure is continuous physical force exerted on or against an object, I think that that's really important to note, because Eva Smith is treated like an object all the way through by different people, mainly by the male characters like Gerald and Eric. But the other Birlings, like Mr. Birling and Mrs. Birling in particular, they don't see her as human. They see her as some low-life scum that doesn't deserve their attention nor their charity. So I think that's really important to note as well. And then the second definition is the use of persuasion or intimidation to make someone do something. Now here, Miss against Eva to make her feel bad about the situation that she's in, rather than Mrs. Birling feeling sympathetic and wanting to help her because of the situation that Eva finds herself in. She's intimidating her by abusing her power in this charity. And as Mrs. Marshall just said, it's very noble being part of a charity, but she's not being charitable. She's not doing anything to help Eva. She's just making her feel bad for the situation that she's in. So moving on from that then, so she doesn't feel bad. She's unlike the other three. I did nothing I'm ashamed of. And I think she repeats that word nothing quite a few times during her interaction with the inspector. I've done nothing wrong and things like that. She says to the inspector, you have no power to make me change my mind and things like that. So looking at this verb ashamed, I did nothing I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. The word shame, the root word shame, means a loss of respect, esteem, or dishonour. So she doesn't feel like she's losing anyone's respect, particularly in her social circle. So people who she's on the board with, people who are of a similar class to her. Gerald, when Mr. Birling turns her away from the factory early on, he says, as someone of their social standing, says, well, you couldn't have done anything else. So she is very much of the mind that, well, it's not going to look bad on me if I turn this woman away who's being grossly impertinent, as she says. But there's a kind of irony here that we lose respect for her, what little respect we had, and we see her as the dishonourable one, because she's abusing her position of power. And because of their lack of remorse as well. As Mrs. Marshall said as well, I think because she drops in conversation, she's not really aware of what's been said and what things have been dropped by other characters. And I think at this point in the play, because we've gone through, 3 other characters were at Mrs. Birling, there's only one other person left to interrogate. And by this point, I think the audience will probably know that Eric is involved. If not, that they know. If not, the audience will know that he is the father of Eva's child. So we've got this dramatic irony that the audience knows through Sheila's protests of her saying, stop, mother, stop talking. Sheila knows that Mrs. Birling is digging herself a deeper hole, and it's just making her look worse. And it's Mrs. Birling's ignorance of what's going on, what else has been said, what she's leading the rest of her family into, that makes her even more dislikable to the audience. And I think again that one of the big takeaways here is that this theme of young and old, it shows the social divide and the difference between the younger and old generation. Whereas Sheila has already kind of admitted her, held her hand up and said, yeah, I had a part to play in Eva's suicide. Whereas Mrs. Birling feels nothing. She thinks, well, she got herself into this mess, and you know, that's her problem. So yeah, I think it's really important to know that this quote is showing the divide between young and old, but also the social divide, because she, you know, Priestley's wanting us to take away from the play as a whole that, you know, capitalist, selfish ways are wrong. We should be working together as a community, as the inspector says in his final speech. And she's very much presenting herself as a selfish character in this quote. Have any of you two got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think it brings me really nicely onto my quotation. I agree with everything you've just said. I think in particular, the idea of how Mrs Birling is used. I mean, we've come into this week's lesson to focus on, you know, is she a cold woman? And I think really your interpretation there really focuses on the idea of how the audience see her and how she might be presented in the play. What's the most important thing in terms of you guys writing about her in the exam is how is she used? How does Priestley force us to see her? And it's really important what Miss Harrison's brought out there, the idea that he deliberately creates this contrast between how she views or how she thinks she'll be viewed by others in her class and in the society that she moves in, and then how he deliberately manipulates us as the audience and the audience in 1945 to present her as cold so that he can deliver his socialist agenda. And she's very, very important for that reason, in terms of the idea that she has this position in society. She demands respect from others and she expects to be treated in a certain way, and yet she doesn't treat people in a kind and courteous way, but she believes that she's entitled to certain layers of protection, and they all do. This is what's sort of shown in the play, that they all believe they have become so accustomed to their little life where they are protected by this privilege, that they've almost believed their own hype. It's almost like they don't notice it. It's entrenched inside them. It's ingrained so deeply that, well, of course we should be afforded this protection, this respect, to the point where it is dangerous. And I think this is how he uses the characters in the play to try to send out warning signals to a 1945 audience that this is the sort of thing that we need to never ever return to. It's a dangerous way of thinking that certain people deserve protection, deserve entitlement. And as we said last week in our distaste for Gerald, Priestley's personal distaste for his upper middle classes are why he's written the play. You know, he really, really got to him as somebody that fought in the war, that the officers were given this protection and were able to give out the orders, but then they weren't the ones that were going over the top, and that is almost like a metaphor for the play. You know, the characters like Mrs Birling can sit on this panel, can give orders, can make judgments, but they're not the ones that are actually out there in the factories. They're not the ones that are actually trying to survive on a minimum wage. And Eva really is in a very difficult position. The social stigma attached to being an unmarried pregnant woman would have been huge. And for her to even have the guts to walk into that panel where she knew she would be judged is big. And she doesn't have any power. Mrs Birling has it all, and unfortunately she uses it just to protect people like herself. Does anyone else want to add anything on to, do you want to say anything about Miss Harrison's quote before I sort of blather on about mine, Miss Wan?
I think when I just was listening, I, like we said, she is this embodiment of abuse of power, because she, even if, you know, this is what's happened to Eva Smith, she's dead now as a result of her not being helped by all these Birlings, they're all protected with more people up in their social circles, because we can go all the way back to when Mr Birling talks about his links with was it the person he plays with golf with? Does anybody remember? It was right in Act 1.
Yeah, it's the Lord Mayor, isn't he?
Yeah. So I think
the chief inspector of the police. He's friends with him as well.
Yeah, and I think that they actually are all protected. And I think, like we said, Priestley's distaste for the upper middle classes is because the protection that they are given means that they can just exploit others with very little repercussions. And I think the final comment I've noticed with this quote, because I think this is a really good quote, Miss Harrison, that you've chosen, is the bit line, unlike the other three, that Mrs. Birling is obviously viewed as a cold woman in the sense that she doesn't even try to align herself with the other characters that have had exposure to the inspector. She obviously truly believes that her social status doesn't just make her financially superior, but she holds a higher moral code than the others, and this is why she can't collectively put herself with the others. So I feel that that's something that's quite something that I noticed with that quote. So we'll move on to Mrs. Marshall's, because it's her turn now.
Oh, thank you. This is mine. Yay. So I'll read out my quote first then, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. But it really does go quite well with the previous one in terms of perhaps intensifying some of the points that we've said. So she says, when she's questioned, she said, whatever it was, I know it made me finally lose all patience with her. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate, fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position. I have to read her horrible voice when I do it, otherwise I can't really channel her.
Miss Marshall was brilliant. I felt like Mrs. Birling was in the room.
I don't want to be associated with Mrs. Birling. Anyway, so Mrs. Birling then. This the bit I want to focus on is that how she views Eva at this moment. As I've already said, remember, Eva is she's desperate at this moment. We talked about the social stigma attached to unmarried pregnant women, so she knew before she went in there that she would potentially be judged. And Mrs. Birling goes right ahead and fulfills those expectations. But the way she talks about her, Miss Harrison mentioned it not being treated as human earlier, and I think this is continued in the language that we look at here. She was giving herself ridiculous airs. So an air, to put on an air means to behave in a way that is more superior than what you deserve to be, or you to think that you're better than everybody else. And so the idea, Mrs. Birling finds Eva sort of trying to have self-respect as something ridiculous, something laughable, as though when she talks about her emotions and she actually says, look, I've no one to turn to, I haven't any money, and I have no way to support this child. She sees this as almost a ridiculous impertinence again. She was claiming, so again here to look at the word claiming, as if she is almost being false about feeling desperate. She's claiming to have elaborate, fine feelings. And if we look at the meaning of that adjective, elaborate, it means something sort of careful, something complicated in the way that it's arranged. So it suggests the idea that somebody like Eva Smith is so base and so primitive in her opinion, a working class woman of her nature. She couldn't possibly have sophisticated feelings and emotions like the rest of us have, people of higher classes. So she's almost suggesting that, she doesn't have proper thoughts and feelings. She's again not human, as if she doesn't deserve to have feelings in some way. And if we delve further in her use of the word scruples here, to have scruples, again, this use of this noun is quite important. If you don't know, to have scruples about something, it means that to be hesitant about something that you know is morally wrong. And I think this is a really important word. If you're going to use Mrs. Birling in an answer in terms of what she represents in Priestley's purpose, it's such an important character because it shows that ironically, Eva is the one that has a moral feeling, and she proves that on more than one occasion. And Mrs Birling doesn't have any morals. She doesn't think about the consequences of what she's doing when she turns Eva Smith away. She doesn't have any scruples, Mrs Birling, whereas Eva, there's lots of occasions where she has shown herself to actually have a real moral conscience, and that's really important for how the characters are designed in the play, and the way that Priestley cleverly manipulates it so that we will sympathise with a working class character like Eva Smith and what she represents. She doesn't try to push things with Gerald. She knows that Gerald would never marry her, and she allows him to go back to the rest of his life. She stops taking money from Eric as soon as she knows that it's stolen. And again, she obviously cares about him and knows that it would ruin his life if she tried to pursue things with him any further. So on more than one occasion in the play, she is shown to have fine feelings and emotions that the audience are encouraged to link with, which again, coming back to the idea that Mrs Birling is a cold character, turns us away from Mrs Birling and intensifies this feeling that she's cold, because of course we've seen this as an audience. We've seen that Eva's acted out of desperation, and that she does have real feelings that we, the audience, identify with, whereas it's very hard to identify with somebody like Mrs Birling. But she almost, the use of the word absurd, she thinks it's absurd that somebody like Eva Smith would possibly have morals about her. So there's that wonderful irony that you can pick up on, to show how he really cleverly turns us away from Mrs Birling and locks our sympathies onto Eva, again, to deliver his socialist agenda. Even talks about a girl in her position, and it might be interesting to look at the interpretation of that. The word position, you could think of her position in society. Again, coming back to the play being about a hierarchy, there's more than one reference to the idea of a wall. Sheila talks about, you mustn't put up a wall between us and them. And if you remember, if you think about it, the Birlings, again, they've got these layers of protection which are in the hierarchy, and the fear of the working classes being upwardly mobile seems very real for them in the play. They're terrified of the idea of people moving up and threatening their position, and so they want to keep her in that position. And Mrs Birling uses her power as the top of the hierarchy on the board in order to turn Eva away and beat her down, keep her back in her position where she can't do anything. And again, her position is one of a complete lack of power, not having this sort of socially stigmatized position. And in fact, the inspector picks up on the word position in his next line, when he sort of makes this grim comment about, well, her position is she's lying on a slab in the hospital with her insides burnt out with bleach. That's her position right now, in which he tries to make Mrs Birling feel guilty and fails. She doesn't show any remorse at any point, and quite often chooses to see things the way that she wants them to be. Does anyone else have anything to add on my quote for Mrs Birling, please?
Yeah, I brilliant analysis as always. You are the Inspector Call expert, Mrs Marshall. I bow down.
I don't know about that.
But yeah, just kind of adding on to what you've said about her being in the position that she's in, I think it's really kind of telling of what Mrs Birling focuses on in people. If we look at the syntax of this sentence, her final word is position. She is obsessed with social status and like you said, the upward mobility. She this is all she focuses on. She doesn't see, the position that she's in, how desperate she's in, the situation that she finds herself in. She's not bothered about any of that. She's just bothered that, a working class woman has found herself in this desperate situation, has used her name, and the fact that she ends this quotation with that word position, I think is is kind of telling of her coldness, really. You know, she's not bothered about anything what she's already revealed to her, and the situation that she's in. She's just concerned about you know, the social status and the position that she's in as a working class woman in front of her, unmarried, pregnant, without a job, without money, without a home. And yeah, I just think it's kind of sad, really, that is the only thing that she focuses on, whereas, you know, other people in her family, particularly the younger ones, have got promised to reform, but I think Mrs Birling's beyond all hope, really. She's there's no chance of her changing.
Yeah,
no, she doesn't want to change.
No.
It's the juxtaposition of the imagery of her being on the dead, and the way Inspector uses it's such blunt language, and I think that's the consequence there of her, because her importance of feeling I need to appear a certain way in society and I can't be afforded to be embarrassed or humiliated, that's what she places more pride in, like her pride in, as opposed to helping somebody. And, you know, I don't think, you know, this is going to be a bit of a plot spoiler, but Priestley then shows you that these consequences can be very far-fetching, because the baby that Eva is pregnant with is also Eric's.
What? No.
No.
Are you serious?
Just a reminder.
Are you serious?
So I think what we've got here is this idea of collective responsibility. You know, the quote that Mr. Birling found so absurd about like bees in a hive. I mean, I know that was to link to the idea of being a worker, but I think it is a metaphor that that can be used for society, that we all work together to have a better whole. And actually what's happened here is we can see the consequences go right down to having affected her, because she is the reason for why Eva is dead, and now the grandchild as well. That's all I have to say on that.
Yeah, my tea's ready, guys. So, you know, I think we've roasted Mrs. Birling now.
Oh, there we are. We've worked hard, and Mrs. Marshall's earned her tea.
Sorry, guys, my tea's ready. We're having fajitas.
Fajitas are nice. Very nice. I'm going to stop the recording then.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.